morning. My name is Ross Ruffing, and this is part one of a ongoing project that we're going to do on self-improvement, and it's kind of a parallel to creating a small permaculture system on a small piece of property. Now, if you're like many of us, you can get caught up in the dreams. You can always think, oh, one day I'll have this, so then I can do that, and one day I'll be able to do this once I have that. I do the same thing constantly. Right now I'm struggling with, will I be able to someday have a permaculture setup, a forest garden, sustainable living, once I own my own property. Now, that's not necessarily in the very recent or very near future. So what can I do now to change the way my future will be and learn from the situation I'm in now, so then once I get to that point, I'll be all that more prepared to take on the opportunities. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend today just a few minutes getting our seeds ready and kind of walking around the house, showing you the different zones that you have to think of in a permaculture setup. And you want to think through these things now so that you don't plant a bunch of stuff and then have things in the wrong spots or in places you don't want them, or shading other areas can always be an issue. Like last year, I had all my tomatoes growing south of my herbs, and it shaded all the herbs. And most of my herbs I either had to transplant, half of them died. So I don't want to mess with that this year. I want to think about it differently. And I want to think about this in terms of self-improvement as well. And something I've been learning from Ty Lopez lately is think with the end in mind. Wake up every day, think about the end of the day. At the end of today, what do you want to have accomplished? For me, I've been up for a few hours. I already got some of my work done. Now I'm going to start on some of my personal projects that I am also viewing as a sense of work. So I want you to do that in your own life too, not just with permaculture, not just with gardening, not just with your personal relationships, not just with your career, with everything. Think about when you die, what do you want people to say at your funeral? That's what you should be living for. That's the only thing you should be living for. Those end goals. Everybody wants to talk about retirement. Everybody wants to talk about different things. But we all end up in the same place in this life. So how do you want to be remembered at that point? Stephen Covey, the author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about this a lot. He worked his entire life with a picture of his newborn self and a picture of his burial plot on each end of his desk, so that he was constantly reminded, the end of my life is just as important as the beginning, and everything I do in between should glorify the end. And so that's what we want to do. We want to make little changes every day that are going to get you closer to those end goals. And it's great to think about that in terms of permaculture, because permaculture is not just a one-season gardening technique. It's a technique of gardening that helps you work with nature, so you can get to a point where most of the work that you're doing is harvesting. We don't want to be replanting plants every year. We want to be sowing the seeds early and then investing in a 10, 15, 20-year process. Really a lifetime process. And that can be really difficult to do in where I'm at now, in a small rental property in central Virginia. It can be a struggle for you, because you're like, well, what am I going to do? Invest in blueberry bushes and asparagus and an apple tree, plant them all in this location and move in 2 years, and then put all this money and time into something that's not going to be mine anymore? But you can't think of it that way. You have to think of it as a learning process. And obviously, I don't want you to spend a lot of money in doing that, and we're going to try our best to spend as little money as possible. I'll try to keep track of my budget and publish it on the site here. But what we want to do is we want to learn self-improvement. If my end goal, my goal for my family and I is to live in a small sustainable house on a small sustainable property with a food forest and lots of things that can help supplement our grocery bills and our energy costs, and help us have a better relationship with the natural world. There's no better way to get to that point than just to do it. So let's get started. We're going to pan over here. So get the tripod loosened up. Pan over here. This is our little cottage here in Central Virginia, just outside Afton. And we'll take a walk here. Hopefully we stay in focus. So when you're thinking of a home like this, you can see here, you have gardens to the left there, right to the left of the front porch, and right to the right. That right area, I think, is probably going to stay mostly the way it is this year. Maybe that small gap in the middle where those plants are growing up, those browning things that I'm not sure what they are, might change those out. We'll see. I have to run all this by my landlord, so that's another side of things that people like myself, and maybe you too, may have to consider. So in permaculture, there are 3 different zones that we're going to worry about. There's 5 total. There's 1, 2, 3. 5, let's start from the outside in. 5 is the wild. 4 is like just on the edge of the wild. 3, you get a little closer to your house. 2 is things that you don't need to access all the time, but you certainly want them closer to your house than not. And then 1 are the things you use all the time. Herbs are a good example of that. You want those close to the kitchen. You want them easily accessible. So as we're walking around the house here, let's think through these things in terms of zones 1, 2, and 3. For the most part, my house is pretty small, so we're only really going to have zones 1 and 2. And I'll show you a quick drawing I made of this house after we take a quick walk around. Now you obviously want to think about this all in terms of where the sun is. You know, when we look out here, that is the eastern facing part of the yard, or rather, well, that's east. And then we have all of the southern sky down here. So this left side of my house down there on the other side is where we're going to finish up. But let's start here. You know, a lot of things out front here we want to do well in eastern sun. As you can see, the tree, the shadow from that tree right there, that does block a fair amount of my morning sun once the leaves come in, especially in this small garden right here to the left of the porch. There is a small rose bush in there that I don't want to tear out, and there are a few other things that I'm not really going to mess with. Probably that big massive thing that just keeps coming back, because it's not a prime food growing location. Now, if I'm able to take out all this grass here and put in a garden in that area, may do my herbs there. That might be a good spot for an herb spiral, but we'll see about that. And then to the right here, we have some nice plants. This plant produces a really great flower. Not sure what it is. As we go through all these things, I'm going to work on my identification of all the plants and shrubs that we have here, as well as in the wild. We'll definitely be taking some trips out foraging as well. So as you can see, all these jaggers coming up here, as we say in Pittsburgh, a lot of that is blackberry or raspberry bushes rather, and we're going to keep those because we like those, and it's nice to have them right next to the house. I don't think very many people have them. They want those jagger bushes out of there as quickly as possible, but we're actually going to take some of those and propagate them all around into this area this year, pending landlord approval. So, and back in here, we have a lot of pine trees, and we're kind of coming around. This part of the yard actually gets a fair amount of morning sun. It's about 8 o'clock, 8:30 here, and you can see that there's still sun, but this shadow is going to start creeping this way as the sun moves that way. So we're not going to focus a lot on this part of the property, But I will think about putting some blueberry bushes back here, because blueberry bushes they like an acidic soil. And the one thing you'll remember about pine trees is they add a lot of acidity to the soil. So that's an important thing to consider. What is going to grow around what's already there. I'm not really in the position that I want to take out any trees, and I wouldn't be allowed to anyway. But even on your own property, try to think about what's already there. You don't want to be taking out a bunch of stuff that doesn't necessarily need to come out. So this is all the north side of the house. As you can see, kind of turns into a storage and staging area. And this brings us kind of to our first zone area right in here. This is the area that I had mentioned earlier that I planted tomatoes along this side. As you can see, kind of the remnants of them from last year. That didn't really work out so well. Not only did they take up all the moisture, they blocked all the sun from everything behind it. As a result, these peppers and some herbs that I had in here didn't flourish very well. So we're going to change that this year. I think I'm going to do mostly lower things. If this ends up being where my herb garden is, it's a perfect location. My kitchen is right in there. So we're going to see how that goes. Just to keep an eye on it, this is a bunch of pawpaw seeds. If you don't know about pawpaws, it's the largest native fruit to North America. You don't see them in the grocery stores because they tend to, they're not very tough. They don't ship very well. And people aren't that great at cultivating them in this country yet. So hopefully we get some pawpaw seeds that pop up in there, and then we'll plant those down where some others are because they need to kind of cross-propagate. So down in here, you can get a better view of it there. That's just kind of been a little bit of a catch area this winter. And as you can see, I've moved some of my herbs, some of my mints, and that pineapple sage crazy looking thing out here, as well as my fig tree and pomegranate tree, which I hope have survived the winter. And another important part of all this is the compost bin. I'm not too keen on this plastic one. It's great because proximity wise it's easy to take stuff out, but we're going to get more into that later in the season. Now we're starting to enter the prime time growing spots. As you can see, the sun is creeping around there, that corner. It's, like I said, about 8:30 in the morning. And in the summer, once the sun is higher in the sky and rising earlier, this area gets sun fairly early in the day, considering that it's still behind the house a little bit. But this whole area right here, all this grass, is really unused yard. And I'm going to take a quick look behind us here. Let me just set up the camera. So, as you can see there, I have some plants that are still going from winter. All this yard really, I think is fairly unusable as far as yard goes. All the way around to that back side where we just were. My thought is just to put one small dirt path all the way around it. That just kind of goes right through gardens on both sides. Now I have horses. I don't personally have horses, but we have horses that spend some time up here. So I have to check with my landlord, and I got to see what kind of things I could plant along that side. It would be okay for horses to munch on if they want to reach through the fence, and then I'm not going to get very concerned. That's another thing you want to think about permaculture, is planting things to help out the rest of the local ecosystem. And horses are part of the local ecosystem for me, so I got to pay attention to what they need and what they might want. And the same thing is true for wildlife. If you have an area that you can plant something that deer love on the perimeter to try to keep them out of the interior where you want your stuff, that's a good way to separate those, fourth and fifth zones from your third, second, and first. Because you can kind of encourage the deer to stay in the wild, which I think is a good thing. If you can encourage them to eat what you don't want, or that you have plenty of, or that they like a lot of, acorns are a good example, then they may not want to come in where the humans are. And if you create some sort of perception barrier, even just by using plants, blackberry bushes are a great example, then it might just prevent that a little bit more, and you won't have to worry about other solutions. So as you can see in here, this is a really good little south-facing garden. I sunk this down in here this year. This winter I acquired an old window from my parents, and I wanted to do something. So I had these cabbage and Brussels sprouts that survived most of our winter. We had a really mild winter here until about mid-February. So I just did the simplest solution I could think of. I dug a hole, I put plants in there, and I put the window right on top. It actually worked out really well. We had some really rough weather in the latter part of the winter, and these things are going, and I'm going to see what they do. So, that is kind of the second best garden area, I'd say. So we're going to do a lot of work on this. Maybe try to plant some things to cover up these ugly things. And that ugly thing. But, what are you going to do? So as we move around the other side of the air conditioner here, this is the prime spot. So you can see I had some greens going this winter. They've kind of died for the most part. They're coming back in this corner for sure. This spinach were a lot smaller the other day, and some, I have some small cuttings in there that might pop up. We'll see. But this did really well. If you have any things like this laying around your house, it's a great way to start seeds, take cuttings. It's a great way to keep greens going all winter long in some climates. In the future, I had previously put aluminum foil on here, but I was told that was probably a bad idea because aluminum's not good for you and it may leach into the soil and up the roots and into the leaves. Different story, but I would definitely insulate this. Next year I'll definitely work to insulate this and try some different techniques, but it's a great way to recycle stuff. I mean, somebody was just throwing it away. I drilled some holes in it, put some cordwood in the bottom and filled it with dirt. That was kind of the first project I worked on with my, at that point, 2 or 3 week old daughter. So this whole area right here is going to be great this year. I'm really excited about this spot. I don't have much space here, but I'm going to utilize it as best I can because it's prime. I'm going to ask if I can build maybe a small raised bed along right there, along those rocks. The thing about the rocks is they're really difficult to cut grass, around. So if I can streamline some edges, it might help out my landlord. And I'm thinking that edge right there where the path comes down across here, I can probably get a 2 foot wide or 2 foot deep bed that'll go all the way down there. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a rundown on all the different areas of my house that we're going to work on. Let's take a couple minutes and get started on seed starts and give you a brief overview on that, and we're just going to take this one day at a time. That's how you got to take your life. That's how you got to take everything in it. You got to say, what's my end goal? What can I do today to get myself closer to that? So, we'll see you in just a minute, and we'll finish up.